Hello class, today we're looking at an essay written in the 1980s by Amélie Oksenberg Rorty titled Fearing Death. And Rorty was an American-Belgian philosopher. She was born in 1932 and passes away recently in 2020. And so she specialized in philosophy of the mind, also Aristotle, Spinoza, Descartes, and she also works on the philosophy, or she worked on the philosophy of emotion. And also she was the wife of the famous pragmatist philosopher Richard Rorty. And so in the essay, Fearing Death, Rorty opens with the Epicurean notion that it's irrational to fear death. And so that also is a way in which we are extending our study of Epicureanism and mortality as well. So she is setting up this question of how it is that we're philosophically examining Epicurus's point, it's irrational to fear death. And so on this, we're thinking of our biological death, or our permanent cessation of consciousness, empirically, remembering that Epicurus was an empiricist. And so the idea for Epicurus is that we're not experiencing anything anymore when we die and we lose consciousness because it's just a dispersal of our atoms. In other words, you cannot experience loss or harm outright, so therefore you should focus on the pleasures of living. And so, likewise, others have thought of death as a type of evil due to the loss of something that's good, in other words, the loss of life. And so we might think of this loss as harmful, yet we'll never feel such a harm if we cease to exist. And so we also sometimes see death as regrettable. So something like death also has the possibility of being regrettable into our projection into the future, right? In other words, we find it regrettable that we'll die someday because we might have projects that we can't see the conclusion of, or we might have descendants and friendships of whom we love and like that we cannot experience their development with them, their growth. And still the emotion of regret is only experienced while one is alive. And with that, there are losses and privations that are regrettable in our daily life. So even if it's recognized that we rationally shouldn't fear death in Epicurus's context, simply because we cannot experience anything while we're dead, let alone regret, fear, or otherwise. So, but yet we still have fears of death, as Rorty points out. And so we are conflicted about our feelings of death, obviously. And so Rorty posits that realistically, we really cannot resolve the tension simply with nothing to add, as Epicurus was suggesting. So she does feel, though, we adjust our attitude about the inevitability of death, that we need to adjust our attitude about the inevitability of death, and perhaps critique some of these issues of Epicurus. And so there's the point that sometimes our fear of death is enough to keep us from increasing the possibility of an early death, for sure, right? We don't want to bring about death any sooner than we need to. So for example, we quit smoking, or we drive safely, we get a safe job. And so to begin with, Rorty is asking us to consider our fear of death rather than the fear that we'll die. And so what is it that we fear when we fear death? It's often revelatory what we fear as a connection to what we find valuable in life as well, as a result of our fears and in close relation to our personal identity as well. And so Rorty itemizes five types of fear we have regarding death. So number one, we fear losing the goods of life. In other words, we fear losing consciousness, and likewise, the company of friends and family, and we fear losing acceptance as well, and bearing witness to their growth and development, and then also the exchange of love we have for these people. And with these fears, we also need to see that these are also fears that we have while we're living as well. In other words, in life, we fear losing friends, family, and acceptance. So in other words, she's trying to draw us to this way in which some of the fears that we have for death are also fears that we have in life in general, not necessarily associated with mortality. And so number two, we fear losing our individual capacity to do certain things, to care for certain people. So sometimes we think that the fear of death is a way that we're attaching this fear of losing our capacity. And so to care for certain people, we might lose, or we might fear to lose the care for certain people and projects. And so with that care, we have personally with them. Yet others are capable of going on without us, yet we fear that we cannot participate in some of the capacities that they are also sharing with us and that we care for. So we're identifying these things as distinct in terms of our identity and our relations with others. Nevertheless, we are incapacitated, etc., etc. These fears of being incapacitated are also fears that we have while we're living. So in other words, we are fearful of these types of tragedies while we're alive, problems of capacity with other people and for ourselves. And so her fourth point also is that we also fear that others will view and assess our lives in ways that we can no longer control or affect. And this too is something that is possible while we're alive. In other words, these are fears that we have while we're living, that we lose control of how it is that people think about us. And we could also think of problems with Alzheimer's and dementia. People have Alzheimer's and dementia while they're alive, and they also have these problems of control in terms of how it is that people are viewing them. So in life, these are fears that we have, and not always just linked to mortality or death, right? And then also we fear that the life that we're living will go on without us, without our participation in it, right? In other words, we won't be able to experience things, or we won't be able to joke about it, or observe it, or improve it. And so we also see this type of fear with death is also a part of how it is that we fear problems in our lives as well, to be exposed as meaningless, where we're thinking of our lives perhaps as meaningless or pointless. And so we see these types of fears also in life, not just mortality. And so the examples of depression or even suicidal thoughts are ways in which we're contending with these issues. And so with 5, we also generally fear the unknown. And so we have sometimes a lack of assurance and perhaps a form of the way in which we are vulnerable, and all of the ways that we also fear these things are problems that we have in life. And so the fear of the unknown is quite easy to see as a fear that we have in life as well. That's one of the problems that we have philosophically, is how it is that we're contending with that which is unknown. And that's not necessarily always a problem with death either. And still, we do see connections with death, for example, in wartime or with regard to extreme violence. Yet, the fear of the unknown is not necessarily or always linked to problems we have with death or fears that we have of death. And so with these fears, it's easy to recognize that these are not only about what could happen when we die. So we fear the possible bad, tragic, and negative things that might happen when we're alive. But at the same time, we also fear these things with our death. And so what about the basic fear of non-existence? Because in a way, she's going through this list to show that we have these problems also in life, but then when we're really focused on the problems of death, what is it that we actually fear? If these problems also could be, or these fears are something that we could compare to fears that we have in life. So she reduces it down to this idea that we are, maybe when we're fearing death, we're fearing non-existence. And so Rorty urges us to see that perhaps with our fears of death, these do appear simply as irrational. And so we will not literally fear we will not fear any of this loss simply because we're no longer existing. And so not existing rationally is without sensation, fear, pain, etc. And so with this, Rorty wants us to ask, is the fear of non-existence even appropriate, right? And so to be sure, it seems appropriate to fear those losses that accompany death, even if it's shown that they're not just about the threat of non-existence. And so even if some of these fears, it's rationally obvious that we will not feel the regrets of loss or that we've died, yet our attitude is perhaps adjustable to the notion that some fears and feelings surrounding our impending death are irrational and not wholly based in facts. And with this, we can say that with death, there are fears that are functional and are irrational, and that there are fears that are dysfunctional that are rational. And so in this sense, perhaps we need to clarify these points with Rorty. So to bring in the example of pain, usually we think about pain that is, we think that pain is easily something to avoid. So to be clear, Rorty is not looking at pain as Dostoevsky posited it as ennobling. Rather, she sees pain as a necessary and welcome part of life. She sees pain as necessary, and it's also an evil in our lives, given that the feeling of pain is a means to direct our lives away from increasing pain, right? So in other words, when we feel certain pains, that's also a warning to do something about it so that we don't continue feeling pain or that pain doesn't increase, right? So in other words, certain pain signals are a way to address deeper issues, to go to the doctor, so on and so forth, these are ways that we want to avoid certain deeper pains. And so that's to suggest that we need a certain amount of physical and mental pain, according to Rorty, in order to take action to avoid any more pain than is necessary, or to increase we want to avoid increasing pain in the future as a safeguarding action, right? So in a way, there's kind of a necessary feature to certain types of pain that we feel. And so here, it's easy to see her point that fear and pain have a similar structure in that we have pain that is functionally irrational and pain that is rationally dysfunctional. And so we want to be capable of feeling pain, and likewise, we have an attitude of fearing death as well. And so it wasn't, if I wasn't afraid of death, it might be more difficult to avoid it happening any sooner, for example. And feeling pain and fear are undesirable, obviously. But yet at the same time, we need to see these emotions as somehow desirable and necessary as safeguarding avoidances. And so, i.e., we need to feel pain and fear as undesirable, while to desire such a thing is irrational. And so even if upon deep introspection, such fears seem irrational, we still have the option to embrace them as functionally beneficial, even if we see that to fear certain events that happen to us in life is not the same as fearing non-existence itself. And so I'll experience no pain or fear, period. And so we still do fear death simply because we're not always making the distinction between what will harm us in life, and that's not always what will harm us in death as well. And so now Rorty has us work these types of fear with regard to the pain surrounding death and living. So we're left with the metaphysical question about fearing death, i.e., fearing the angst of one's non-being. And so, which is a type of fear and angst Epicurus was aiming for us to get rid of, and in order to live a more pleasurable life. And so this has to do with the Epicurean notion that to manage and work on the pain of our fear of death is to then have a pleasurable life. And so as Rorty reminds us, for Epicurus, this type of fear is what is distracting us in terms of avoiding and fearing death. That leads us to seek pleasure in terms of rational goods, so on and so forth. And this problem is a way in which we are not contending with the pain that death brings about in terms of its anticipation, or the way in which we're anticipating death, right? So these and many other actions are what we need to do, according to Epicurus, as a way to work through our fears and pains of death, as opposed to simply and rationally reorganizing the idea that death is non-existence, or he wants us to get to the notion that death is rationally non-existence, and that in it we will fear no pain or have no, we will no longer have fear of anything at all. And so again, for Epicurus, if we let go of our fear of death, we'll be better off. And so Rorty then cites some interesting points on our reasoning in terms of reflecting on the Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant. So Immanuel Kant was born in 1724, passes away in 1804, and he was a famous critic of the limits of our reasoning, such as the limitation we have in terms of the existence of God, also eternal life, what is beyond our perceptions, and so forth. And so to do so, to have these limitations, is for Kant something that is beyond our reasoning capacity. And to reify God, the soul, and eternal life is, for Kant in this context, a means that we frequently extend our reasoning into realms that are in violation of reasoning itself. So when we're reasoning about God, the afterlife, what is beyond perception, we are actually violating the very way in which we're understanding reasoning itself for Kant. And so the structure of rational argument is such that we are indiscriminate of the content of our reasoning, as Rorty points out. So in other words, given the neutrality of our reasoning, we usually cannot help reasoning into areas that are beyond our reasoning, is the idea. And so we do this with our fear of death, and we fear all the things that we fear in life just as much. And also, really, because we don't know any better. And also, some of these fears are functionally helpful in the sense that we steer away from danger and don't bring about our death any sooner than we need to. So this is also while holding to the Epicurean notion that some of our coping with such fears are worth re-examining as vain, trivial, or paranoid. And so once again, what you want to recognize there is that Rorty is showing us this notion that, is it really irrational to fear death? And she's showing us how it is that we could set this up philosophically with the help of Kant to see that the way in which we're overextending our reasoning also has to do with problems that we have in terms of overextending our fears into the unknown and likewise our death itself. So we'll talk more about this in class, and thank you, and talk to you later.